another type of loss that we see more and more of, that people are finally beginning to reach out around, is like pet loss.
Yes.
So as couples are choosing not to have families, or individuals are not having children on their own, they are having animals in their life, and those relationships are significant.
Yes.
I mean, you have 2 dogs, I have 2 dogs, and I am totally that pet parent that like looks at my very young dogs and gets sad because I think like, oh, in 10 years, we're gonna have to deal with this. But when I was in my 20s and I had my dog, Tessa, she was everything. She was my companion, and she like got me through my 20s and my early 30s, and was there. When I bought my first house, she was there. She's the first dog to pee on the rug. And even, for a time I lived and worked in the Northwest Territories, and she came with me. And she was just in my life. And when I got married, she was there. She was there when the first 2 of my kids were born. And when it was time to say goodbye to her, when it was time to say goodbye to a very rich life that she had had, again, one of the most difficult goodbyes, because she was constant. When we think about attachment, I mean, she was probably had insecure attachment. She had anxious attachment, right? But I felt very securely attached to her because I would come home from work and she's there, and my weekends were spent with her, and we did go on adventures together, and then she was gone. And I had to decide that. And I remember taking her to the vet a few days before, and just talking with one of the vet techs, because I was struggling to make the decision, even though I knew it was the right decision, even though I knew it was the merciful decision. I still struggled because I didn't want to say goodbye, and I didn't want to feel sad about her not being in my life. So the vet tech, she said, Hilary, you gave her a great life. She was a rescue, and so you gave her a great life, and you guys had adventures together, and now you have, your husband and your kids. And I remember thinking, I feel bad and I feel wrong asking for more time. She was 16. I mean, this dog, really, she lived a long life, and I just thinking like, but I just want like one more walk. Just one more walk, one more adventure. And then ultimately on the day that Tessa died and we took her in, I remember I laid on the floor with her as they gave her the medication. And, she has been gone, well, almost 10 years. And I still think of her, and I still miss her. I still miss her because she was just such a significant relationship in my life. And I think this is something, like, again, it doesn't get talked about. And it definitely doesn't get recognized. You don't get a grief day, because a bereavement day, because your dog died or your cat died. And really, those are significant relationships. And with pet loss, we think of pet loss like, oh, my dog or my cat or, lived for many years, and then I had to choose to put them down, or they, became quite ill. But even with pet loss, there can be traumatic loss.
Absolutely.
Right? So there can be a vehicle accident, or there can be a pet can get lost. We also had that experience. My husband's cat got out, and we never saw him again, and they had been together for 15 years. And that was such a difficult loss because he just was gone. And so we never knew what had happened. Did he get hit by a car? Was he taken by a coyote? We lived in a neighborhood where that would have been a thing, could have happened. Did another family? So we just sort of settled that he was a beautiful cat, and another family just found him, and Tigger lived a his final years with some family that ignored all of our posters,
Sure.
because that's the only way that really that could be managed. And I think, you know, we worry about pet loss a little bit too, because we think, oh, our kids, like, how are our kids going to manage it? And, you know, kids are some of my favorite grievers, you know, as a childhood griever myself, because kids are going to talk about it if they want to talk about it, and they're not going to talk about it if they don't want to talk about it. And they're going to do that puddle jumping where, you know, so here I'm going to talk about, you know, grandma or my pet or my parent or my sibling. And then I'm going to jump in this other puddle, and I'm going to be talking about what happened at school today, or that the sky is blue and look at that cloud that looks like a dinosaur. And then they're going to go back to it. And I think we have so much to learn from kids about grief. You know, me as a child, I definitely heard that, like, don't cry, be strong. I sang recently to somebody, I remember so clearly, this, like, well-meaning person in our church community saying, you know, your mom's had such a hard time, you don't need to cry about this. You know, your mom doesn't need to see you cry about this. And so I had a stiff upper lip, and off I went. And into my 20s, that was where it showed up, because it never got dealt with. And so I was struggling to kind of make some of those leaps, where now, you know, it's definitely better for kids. Still not great, but it's definitely better. And, you know, I think if you have a grieving child in your life, you let them lead the way, because they're going to teach you something, and they're going to show you, like, kind of like how it's done. Because they do such a good job. Kids do such a good job of holding that tension. And being like, I feel sad. And now I'm...
they jump in with both feet, right? And then when they're done, they're done. And then when they're ready, they do it again, right? But it's all a matter of what emotions pop up for them in the moment.
I remember I had a patient years and years ago come in to the Emerge that I was working at the time, and the year before, there had been a tragic loss in their family, and they came in because they had a fever that just wouldn't go away, and mom was worried. And the little kid said to me, oh, you know, my sister died. I don't think I'm gonna die, but mommy's worried. And I looked at the mom, and she looked at me, and she's like, it's true. And I was like, okay. And she's like, I am worried. And I said, okay, then we're going to do everything we can to take care of you and to take care of your little one. And, you know, and then the sibling talked on and off about how their experience was in the hospital versus their sibling that had died. And, you know, the other nurses were like, oh, this makes me so uncomfortable. And I was like, honestly, they're not uncomfortable. It's okay. Like, be okay with this.
And it's holding space for that kid, right? It's like us pushing through our own comfortability.
Big time.
Right? To be able to hold space.
I think that's huge. And, you know, even in the therapy community, right? Not all therapists are comfortable.
Oh, no, not by a long shot.
Right. So if you could, I would say, looking to you as someone who is much more experienced in therapy, who's like, you know, fancy senior therapy person.
Been doing this for a long time.
Yes, you have. What would you say to, like, a newer therapist, or a therapist who hasn't worked through some of their own grief stuff?
I mean, first of all, I would tell them to go to therapy. If they're
sure.
not already, go
Cheers
to therapy.
To that,
And I think part of that is also going, you know, in your own life, you have experienced traumas, whether you recognize or acknowledge it or not. Right? And whether you remember it or it's forgotten. And when you've experienced that, there's all these emotions connected to it. And lots of those emotions fall under the realm and the umbrella of grief. And so, you know, I'm a big believer that for us to take our clients deep, we actually need to have been there already.
I agree.
Right? Or we need to be willing to go there and push through our own uncomfortability. And so, as a therapist, I think that we actually are that barrier for many people, not always, but many, because of our own stuff and our own challenges and willingness to go to some of those places for ourselves, not even for them. We are more than happy to go there with you. Right? But for ourselves, not so much. Right? And so, you know, I think it's I think it's one of these really challenging spaces to be in where, you know, as a therapist, I had to ask myself this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
Do I
me
love
too.
myself enough to actually heal myself?
Yeah.
Right? And to provide space for myself to heal.
Yeah.
Right? And, you know, that asking myself that actually came from one of my own therapy sessions. Right? And it was this thing that came up where it was like, love actually heals.
Yeah.
Right? And I knew that. I knew that.
Yeah,
and
sure.
I operated that way. But for myself.
Yeah.
Like, love actually heals me.
Yeah.
And so, do I love myself enough?
Right.
Do you love yourself enough?
Right.
And see yourself as being worthy enough and valuable enough to actually do the hard work.
Yeah.
To actually heal.
Right.
Right? And I don't think healing can be done in isolation.
Yeah.
Right? It has to be done in relationship. It has to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, you know, I think it's one of those things where, like, are we willing to be risky enough?
Yeah.
Right? And be uncomfortable enough to deal with the hard things.
Yeah.
And confront the hard things and have the hard conversations. Because it's a lot easier to do it when it's about you than when it's about me.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Right?
And I think that's like one of the gifts of our personal experiences and our own like grit in being like, I am unwilling to sit in a space where I'm debilitated by, you know, choices of other people. I remember very significantly, I was away with one of my cousins and we were visiting our grandmother, and we had sort of just decided in that moment like we were going to be friends because our family was pretty fractured on that side. And she said like we could just like let the decisions of other people like influence us, or we could just be like, hey, you're cool, like I like you, let's be friends. And that was so shaping for me in many areas, because I sort of took that really to heart. And that was in many ways the start of my own journey into therapy, because I thought like, yeah, like lots of things happened to me. And I can only be responsible for how I react and how I kind of manage those things. So I'm not going to let, you know, the decisions of other people like mute me from being who I want to be and who I think I'm called to be. And so a lot of that meant like leaning into the grief and the sadness and being willing to let it be painful. You know, I remember instances where like primordial crying, you know, came out of me in therapy or after therapy sessions, or, you know, on a walk in the woods, because the physical pain that I felt from some of the losses I had endured was, you know, needed to get out. And, you know, that was a way that I was able to deal with it. And truly, like, it made me better in every relationship when I leaned in and when I decided that I was gonna like truly deal with it. So now I'm sure my clients get sick of it, because sometimes I almost go looking for it, because I know that loss and grief shows up in every person's life. And how and what that was, and how and you know how you react to it, and you know what you've chosen to do with it is shaping who you are, your worldview, you know, your glasses, right? We sometimes talk about how the glasses that we look through and the lens we look through. And so, you know, grief is this mirror in my glasses. And I think it's this mirror in most people's. And we just don't always call it that.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, you know, my own journey and just, you know, similar, right? Those moments of like the complete, like guttural cry pain, because it was like it actually caused such physical pain. And you know, part of my story is like I took some of that physical pain out on myself in my own body, right? And you know, coming to the place where I decided it was a cognitive like choice that I made. That I was like, I will no longer allow like this physical pain, this grief, this trauma hold me back from being who I want to be and where I want to go.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And for me, that looked like lots of conversations, lots of therapy. And for me, you know, I came to the point where I was like, okay, I'm ready now.
Yeah.
Because I knew I was going to be, but I wasn't ready yet. And I knew it. And I got to the point where I was like, okay, I am ready now.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I went to go visit a friend of mine, and I went for a week. Right? And we did an EMDR intensive for a week.
Right.
And it was life-changing for me in so many ways. And part of it was just, yes, it was the EMDR, but it was also like I stayed with my friend and his wife, and you know, they like made me breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Yeah.
And like
that care.
we would sit and have tea, and there was this care, and we would sit on the deck in the morning and have coffee and breakfast, and like it was this holistic care that really happened. And then we also did the EMDR trauma work.
Right.
Right? And you know, I spent lots of time journaling and hiking and running and, you know, meandering kind of through Colorado. That's where I was. And there was this space of the intensity of the trauma is gone.
Yeah.
Right? I haven't forgotten it. I never will.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The intensity of it is gone.
Yeah.
The grief is still there.
Yeah. Yeah.
The intensity of the grief has diminished because the intensity of the trauma has diminished.
Correct. Yes.
But now what does my life look like?
Right.
Walking forward.
Yeah.
Still holding this grief.
That's right.
Right? Still holding the trauma back here.
Yeah.
Without the intensity, without the punch of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But actually not being held back by those smears or those words on my glasses anymore.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I have noticed personally a significant shift internally since that happened. Right? Whether it's been noticed externally or not, I don't know, and it doesn't really matter actually.
Sure. Yeah, agree. Yeah.
But I have noticed my own relationship with myself, the world, and others. Actually, as I've worked through those traumas and that grief.
Yeah. And I think, you know, that's such a good point, is that, like, again, leaning into it and being willing to do the hard things has healed that relationship with yourself. And that, you know, that's what therapy is about, and that's what grief work is about. So no matter what the loss is, whether it is a parent, a spouse, you know, a child, a pet, a relationship, a dream, all of those things call your identity into question for sure. There is trauma that is associated with it, and it is being courageous enough. And, you know, one of my sort of like lines is, you know, grief work is courageous work of the heart. And some days that feels so cliche to say, and I think of myself as a griever and I'd be like, I'd probably roll my eyes at the person that said that to me, but it is so sincere, because when we commit to working through our trauma and our loss and our grief, we know there's going to be pain. You know, it doesn't come without pain, and to take that step forward anyway is super courageous. Right? It's super courageous and life-changing. Right? Yeah. And I think that if there's like, you know, like a take-home message, that would be like one of them is that when we do that grief work and we are willing to step into our pain, then we're showing ourselves love and saying, like, I want to repair my relationship with me so that I can live my best life in the best way for me in this season. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I would say if we could show up and care for ourselves the way that we care for other people, right?
Yeah.
Like, that would change our lives.
Yeah, agree.
Right?
Yeah,
and
agree.
so just as it's courageous and it's loving yourself and it's caring for yourself, it's a, like, can you show up for yourself?
Yeah.
Right? The way that you would show up for other people.
Yeah. Yeah.